So John is a member of the Socialist Worker Network in Ireland and a member of People Before Profit. He's also the editor of the Irish Marxist Review and the author of Lenin for Today, amongst other books, which is available either after the meeting or from bookmarks. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to John.
Thank you very much. Comrades, I'll start with the fact that outside of the revolutionary socialist left, and that's quite a big outside, unfortunately, there is close to an overwhelming consensus, a large majority anyway, that would answer the question at the head of this meeting, is Leninism authoritarian, with a resounding yes. And so I think it's a good idea to begin with what we're up against. And what we're up against is a narrative of the whole history of Lenin and Leninism, which was carefully constructed in detail by, in the first place, the American establishment academy on behalf of the American state, but with its huge cultural and intellectual influence spread around the world through innumerable experts, scholars, professors, and so on, including many former opponents of Lenin from Russia, from the Soviet Union, ex-Mensheviks, and so on. I'm going to try and summarize that narrative as consisting of 5 main propositions. Right. First, that Lenin, from the beginning, was driven by a personal will to power. It was his personality. He was an authoritarian person, and he was after power for himself. Second, that he constructed the Bolshevik Party as an authoritarian party and as an instrument of his will to power, as a top-down organization, often seen as being outside of the working class and standing above it. Third, that the Russian Revolution, which began as a spontaneous and democratic revolution, was subverted by Lenin and the Bolsheviks in an opportunistic coup in October 1917. That was not a genuine people's revolution. That was a coup from above which established Lenin and the Bolsheviks in power. Fourth, that once in power, Lenin and the Bolsheviks established an authoritarian regime, a dictatorship over the proletariat, which then led directly on to the nightmare of Stalinism. So there was direct continuity between Lenin and Stalin, Leninism and Stalinism, and the totalitarian dictatorship that prevailed in the 1930s. And lastly, fifthly, that Leninists today are people who are trying to repeat this trajectory, and Leninist parties are inherently authoritarian for 2 reasons. One, because they have the anti-democratic method of organization known as democratic centralism, and secondly, because they consider themselves vanguard parties which stand above and have some kind of right to dictate to and lead the rest of the movement and the working class. That's a summary of their case. It's worth stressing how pervasive this is, because it's clearly an argument that is put by the right, and the right, as I said, particularly originally in America, but the rest, but it also is accepted by almost all mainstream social democrats, some left social democrats, and it stretches as far as anarchists and various versions of libertarians and autonomists and so on. And just to illustrate that point, I want to show a clip of a very well-known person, considered an authority on this, putting this argument. I hope this works. I do it right. This is, you'll recognize, Noam Chomsky.
As blithely as you did tonight. I say that, and I think it's also important to point out that that is an unquestioned assumption and also an easy applause getter we saw that you share with the mainstream media. And I think if it were actually that simple, the horrific kinds of measures that even bourgeois historians describe as a counter-revolution under Stalin would not have been necessary if they were all the same to begin with. Now, in short, to sum up, the situation that you have outlined tonight, I think, is extremely serious, and I think it's important that we all take it seriously. What we're talking about is literally the fate of millions of lives around the world, particularly in the international politics that you described. That being the case, then I think we need a full and a serious and a fair discussion of various different alternatives, not just talking about the horrors of capitalism, but actually how to change it to end this stuff once and for all.
Well, I think you made it, yeah. I think, well, there's several questions there. One is about the discussion of the United States, and I think what I said is approximately what you said, except I didn't use some of that rhetoric. Which I don't think is particularly helpful, to tell you the truth, either analytically or to understand or whatever, but it's the same picture. John Jay had it straight. The people who own the country ought to govern it, and the people who own the country have basically now are a network of corporations and conglomerates and banks and so on. They ought to govern it, and the way they do it is by the methods we've described. Now, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I didn't happen to talk about it tonight, but I've written about this topic. I haven't just made the charge. I've written about it and explained why I think it's true. And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons. So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now, that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Now, when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, he took a different line. Quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. If you take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for workers' organization and so on. In fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after they took, Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is that, a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, doesn't mean he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And same, you could say they're defective instruments, and they worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which...
I'm going to stop it there because actually I started the clip slightly before I meant to on the thing, and I realized that I didn't want it to go on too long. I had time to do the meeting, but you get the message. And what's interesting there is there's parts of that are just silly, and it's my experience that if you get up and spout the main line, you can present yourself as an expert on things you know nothing about, like the idea that Anton Pannekoek was the mainstream Marxist. If people know the history, this is just factually untrue. The mainstream Marxist before 1914 and so on was Karl Kautsky, and the centre of German social democracy. Pannekoek was an entirely marginal figure. He wasn't in charge of Marxist education for the Marxists. He was a lecturer at one school. It's like saying you spoke at Marxism, so you were in charge of education for the Marxists. You know, it's silly stuff. You know, and he gets the name of state and revolution mixed up and so on. But leaving aside the silly stuff, as long as you're on that mainstream message, you can present yourself as an expert and say you're dealing with the facts. But leave aside that. I'll return later to Chomsky. What I want to do, first of all, is to present an argument against all the what I call the 5 elements of that narrative. That's a lot. I'll do it as quickly as possible, particularly because I want to say a fair bit about Leninist organization and so on today, which I think is an issue we confront in the movement. So first of all, the idea that Lenin was from the outset possessed of a will to power and saw himself as Chomsky said, you know, striving to create an organization that would eventually seize power and establish his dictatorship is, to my mind, makes absolutely no psychological sense whatsoever. I'm not in favour of individualistic psychological explanations of history, but even in those terms, it makes no sense. The idea that in the 1890s, Lenin would get himself sent to Siberia after joining an organisation of 30 people, knowing that in 25 years' time he was destined to take power, is just absurd, to be honest. And attributing this to other Lenin, I just think it's extremely stupid. And you could go through, the idea that the smart move to make in 1914, when war breaks out, was to oppose the war with every fibre of your being, to take the position of turn the imperialist war into a civil war, a revolutionary division. Obvious opportunistic move, just like an American, just like an American politician. Okay, silly, right? But the idea that the Bolshevik Party was created as an instrument of Lenin's will and was an anti-democratic and undemocratic party simply, again, does not fit the facts at all. There was a split in 1903 between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, as people know. It doesn't matter what the split was about at this moment. But it's interesting, isn't it? Why were the Bolsheviks called the Bolsheviks? Because they were the majority. Bolshevik, that's the Russian word for means majority. Majority people. That's what it means. The Mensheviks were the minority. It means that. That's what it means. They were the majority and the minority. The problem in 1903 was not that Lenin was being undemocratic. He won the vote. The problem was that the Mensheviks wouldn't accept it. You know, I mean, it's interesting because the whole history is, oh no, this was an anti-democratic move by Lenin. No, it was actually the reverse. The Bolshevik Party, throughout its existence, right, before and after it took power, had vigorous debates, all controversies, different tendencies, whose names now mean very little to people like Otzevists, the up and outers and boycotters who didn't want to participate in the elections to the Tsarist Duma, and all sorts of liquidationists and so on. But they were all these different tendencies, and they fought out and argued. Lenin didn't always win. He voted against boycotting the Duma, for example, after in 1906 and 1907, voted with the Mensheviks on this, against the majority of his own party, and lost their position on that. And so the idea that this was some kind of Leninist dictatorship is absolute nonsense. When Lenin returned to Russia in 1917, his position of the need to move to all power to the Soviets and struggle for workers' power was a minority position within the leadership. He was regarded as having gone mad, and so on, and being completely out of order. He won the vote at the April conference, not because the Bolshevik Party was undemocratic, but precisely because it was democratic, precisely because what he was saying corresponded to what the mass of workers who are flooding into the party from the Vyborg district, from the factories and so on, what they wanted. That was why he won it. So it's not true that the Bolshevik Party was in any way undemocratic. There's a theoretical argument to back this up, which is based on two sentences in What Is to Be Done, when Lenin said that socialism has to be introduced into the working class from the outside. He took that line of argument from Karl Kautsky. It was, I think, a clumsy formulation, right? But it was not proof of Lenin's elitism or his hostility to the workers or his desire to dictate to the workers. It was an argument in favour of making political propaganda in the working class movement, not being purely economistic, because he thought workers could and would develop political consciousness. So the argument is turned around. The opposite, it doesn't true. Anybody who wants to go into that in great detail, there's an enormous book about it by Lars Lee on why Lenin actually was the most enthusiastic about workers' political consciousness. Of course, that many of the academics who seize on that line do so for a very simple reason. It's actually they don't think workers can develop political consciousness. So they actually seize on that argument and think, you see, this is the key to what Lenin said. Besides which, Lenin revised his position on that through the experience of the 1905 revolution. Never repeated that formulation and said, I was bending the stick. And so on. That's one of the origins of the famous bending the stick thing that people quote, was precisely that statement. So I don't accept that either. The argument that the Russian Revolution was a coup, which you've heard Chomsky put and so on, again, is completely false. I think the simplest way to understand this is to say, if it was simply a coup, why was it successful? If a few thousand socialists marched down to Buckingham Palace and the House of Commons and tried to occupy it, what would happen? I mean, I tell you, if anything other than what would happen would be the case, I think the SWP might have tried it by now. What would happen would be they would send the cops and the army and clear you out. Simple, by clubs and batons and truncheons or guns or whatever. That's what would happen. Everybody knows it. That's why nobody tries to do it. simple. Why didn't that happen when the few thousand stormed the Winter Palace? I'll tell you why it didn't. Because the entire army, the police force was long gone because they'd been smashed by, and virtually the entire army had come over to the side of the revolution. And as Martov said, Lenin's opponent, the entire working class, the entire industrial proletariat is supporting Lenin and looking for their emancipation. It takes the appearance of a coup because 9/10 of the revolution had been achieved before then. And it is absolutely significant here that Lenin doesn't even start arguing for insurrection until the Bolsheviks had won a majority in the Soviets. They win a majority in the Soviets at the end of August, beginning of September, by fighting against the Kornilov counter-revolution and so on. That's when they win a majority, and it's then that he starts to talk about moving to take state power. So it's completely false that it was a coup. Now, what about Leninism in power? Is there an element of authoritarianism here? Yes, there is, and for a very good reason. Let me quote Engels writing in advance on this. Engels says there were people who said that Marxists were authoritarians around in his day, and he said this about them. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will on the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon. Authoritarian means, if such there be at all. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionists. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day if it had not made use of this authority of the armed people against the bourgeois? Should we not, on the contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough? That was what Engels said. I think Engels counts as a mainstream Marxist, though that gets debated by some people. That's what Engels said on this question, and Lenin fully understood that, it has to be said, and was clear about it. And of course he was absolutely right, because following the revolution, following the October Revolution, the seizure of power by the Soviets, there is the most horrendous reaction unleashed against the revolution by the Tsarist generals, the White Guards, backed by, as soon as they could get it together and stop killing each other, by the forces of imperialism and so on, the 14 armies invading Russia, etc., and they had to fight for their lives. And civil war, sadly, is not a pleasant thing. It is not, as it were, a school for good manners. It involves all sorts of bitter fighting, and of course excesses and atrocities get committed. It's significant here that the people who attack the Bolsheviks, and Lenin in particular for their authoritarianism in those circumstances, just ignore the objective conditions in which this was occurring. And they don't measure how the Bolsheviks behave in comparison to how any other regime behaves in such a situation or when fighting for its life. No, they act as if it was just the fulfillment of Marxist ideology and so on. The decline of the Soviets that he goes on about is as if, oh well, Lenin and Trotsky suppressed the Soviets. How? Imagine you had Soviets all over Russia, full of workers. The Tsar couldn't repress them. Kerensky couldn't repress them. How did Lenin and Trotsky repress them? Unfortunately, well, that's not what happened at all. What happened is the life drained out of the Soviets because the working class was smashed in the conditions of the Civil War. But this real history is left out because you can just assume, oh, it was Leninist authoritarianism. Okay. I'm just checking my time because I want to say something about the last part of the argument, which is about Leninism today. Two parts of this: democratic centralism and vanguardism. I want to argue that democratic centralism, far from being an anti-democratic form of organisation, is the most democratic form of organisation. You would think, when you hear people say democratic, oh, that's bad, you would think, for example, that the alternatives to it yielded splendid democracy. what are the alternatives to democratic centralism? To the idea of debate followed by unity in implementing policies. What are the alternatives to that? One alternative is the social democratic model. The Labour Party in Britain, the Irish Labour Party for that matter, or social democratic parties generally. Their policy is, the way they operate is, you have party conferences, you make speeches, you pass resolutions, and everybody goes off and does what they want to do, especially the leadership. That's their policy. And the Labour Party has survived on the idea that its parliamentary party could ignore party conferences. For the best part of 100 years it's been doing that. For years and years they used to pass motions in favour of nuclear disarmament. Getting to power, not only did they not disarm, they built more and joined NATO and supported the American war effort. And if anybody said about the party conference, the party conference, what does that matter? We're elected by the people, you know. So they weren't responsible to the party conference. And that applied to leader after leader all the way through to Tony Blair and beyond. And that is not just a deviation of the British Labour Party. That is what generally is the rule in how social democratic parties operate. I won't bore you with the stories from the Irish Labour Party, but exactly the same sort of thing, because their version of democracy actually doesn't control the leaders. The point about democratic centralism, it's always talked about as a way of the leadership controlling the members. Actually, if you think about that, if the leadership, of course, can lead and persuade the members, and the notion of loyalty to party discipline and so on, producing a united action, has a part to play. But if the membership really don't like it, they can defy the leadership in the simplest possible way. They leave. And what can you do about it? Nothing. So you cannot use democratic centralism in any way if you want to build a serious organisation that ignores the view of the membership. But what it does do is give you a mechanism for controlling your leaders. It means, actually, that party decisions have to be implemented by Alex Kalinikos. In Ireland, it means that party decisions have to be implemented by Richard Boyd Barrett, Breed Smith, and Gino Kenny, who are our TDs. And we call it a political committee, not a central committee of the SWN, has 2 out of those 3 on it. They are all subject to party discipline in what they do and say in the Parliament and what they do and say around the country. It's a means of democratic, not undemocratic control. What about the notion of horizontalism, the notion of the anarchist autonomous version of this? You have no leaders, you make all decisions by consensus and so on. Actually, this is extremely undemocratic. The notion that you make all decisions by consensus, if you have a serious question to decide, i.e. one in which you don't all agree, and it matters, consensus is a disaster. Imagine you just took every strike vote on the basis of we're going to achieve consensus first. Wouldn't the employers love that? If I was a boss, I would love the idea that the workers could never go on strike until they had 100% agreement. I need one boss's agent among the workforce, and there'd be never a strike ever again, because he would just say, I don't agree, and then, you know, whatever they do, and so on, and it would never happen. No serious class struggle would ever occur on the basis if you took consensus literally. And look at what actually happens. Look at the history of anarchist organisations. Every anarchist organisation that's ever existed had leaders. They just weren't always open and elected. You can begin with Bakunin. I used to do meetings on anarchism and ask, did anybody in the audience know what Bakunin's organisation was called? And usually there was one person who did. We all heard of Bakunin, the great anarchist. Almost nobody's heard of his organisation. It was secret, but he was the leader of it. You hear about the Makhno movement in Russia, the anarchists in Russia. Anybody know what his movement was called? No. You know, it's by the name of the leader. And so it goes on to Danny Cohn-Bendit in France and so on. And look more recently, and it was a great movement, the Indignados movement in Spain. It was a brilliant popular movement involving millions of people and so on. was anti-political party, anti-leadership. First of all, being anti-political parties, you have to enforce that by authoritarian means. I remember talking to our comrades, why can't you take your banners? Why can't you go and give out your leaflets? Oh, we'd be thrown out. In other words, the no parties turns into actually a ban on people. It's actually fairly authoritarian. And then look what happens. The moment they have a political struggle to wage in terms of elections, that movement is hegemonized by, not exactly but broadly, by Podemos. Podemos, radical left movement, but which is explicitly a movement from the top down, created by, not by Leninists, but by left academics. And they said so. They said, we don't want to negotiate with the rank and file and go through that. We're going to say what we'll do it, and we'll attract support. And when they attracted support, one of the first things they did was actually disempower their grassroots and establish the effective leadership of the self-appointed leadership and so on, and turn Podemos, therefore, into sort of another part of the political system. Okay, so it is not true that rejecting democratic centralism in some way or other gets you a more democratic form of organisation, it gets you a less democratic. What about the vanguardism? This is nice because it's, well, I say nice for anti-Leninists. They're vanguardists. Makes you sound terribly elitist, but it's a complete misunderstanding of what Leninist vanguardism means. It does not mean that we, or whoever you're talking about, or the Bolsheviks, are the self-appointed leaders of the movement. Not at all. It means that within the working class, there is always uneven development. There are, in every factory, in every workplace, in every school, wherever you're talking about, there are those who actually take the lead, those who actually take the initiative in calling a strike, in organising the picket line, in resisting the employer, or in every community in organising to defend council housing, whatever you're talking about. There are the people who take initiative in the working class, whether we like it or not. Being a vanguard party means that you try to bring those people together on the basis of a political organisation. You only become the vanguard by being able to be in the front of the struggle, being able to say what you do tomorrow, what you do next Friday and Saturday in your case, but also beyond and so on, by giving a concrete lead, not a lead as in you give people orders, but a lead as in you propose a way forward that you try and win other people democratically towards. It's again an extremely democratic concept and democratic way of operating. I just want to say a word about Lenin in this context. All the great revolutionary Marxist leaders, from Marx and Engels themselves, through Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Gramsci, particularly. Actually, and I would include Tony Cliff in this, all of them, when they had the opportunity is not always there, depends on circumstances, but when they had the opportunity, established close, organic links with precisely those vanguard workers of their times. I'm old enough, and one or two of people in this room will have been old enough to see Cliff doing it, right? But of all of them, no one was this more true than it was of Lenin, right? He was quite different, for example, from Plekhanov, who was aloof and didn't know how to relate. Lenin, from the beginning, was involved in factory agitation. Of course, a lot of time he was in exile. When he was in exile, he found any worker he could to talk to. But he always had this deep connection with the actual living workers and actual living workers movement. And when you read Lenin, he's always speaking with that kind of worker militant in mind. He sees the world through and in conjunction with the eyes of that worker. And when it comes to October 1917, Lenin's fight is with the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, who are conservative on the question. And he threatens to resign at one point. He says, if you won't organize the insurrection, because the revolution, the fate of the revolution is at stake, if we don't act now, the counter-revolution will crush us. He threatens to resign and says, I'll resign from the Central Committee and I'll go to the sailors. Meaning, not obviously just the random sailors, the sailors of the revolution. I will go to those people. I'll go to the workers. All right, the Kronstadt and so on. This is Lenin, extreme democracy. Now, the last point I'll make is this. We Leninists, everywhere in the world, more or less, are a tiny minority, unfortunately. Obviously, we aspire not to be, but we are a tiny minority. Clearly, we cannot dictate to or order the working class about. That's an absurd idea. Absolutely. We can only hope to win wider layers of workers and students if we operate, democratically ourselves. It's extremely important. People won't accept an undemocratic organisation. The working class is a democratic class. They'll reject it. Right? And if we operate democratically in the movement. Democratically in the movement does not mean passively. It doesn't mean not giving a lead, but it means acting with people in struggle, in united fronts, in workplace organisation, in unions, in the fight against racism, in all the struggles that we face. We have to respect the democracy of the movement, and only if we do that will we be able to win people on a wider scale. So all of this argument that are presented, it's important for the history, very important for the history, because the history was designed to close off, to rule out with a single, they're all authoritarians, and so on, to close off the one example we have of socialist revolution. Its aim is to shut that down. Right, so it's important to reclaim the history, but it's also important for our practice today.